A lot of things have suddenly been banned during the Trump administration, questioning NATO, securing the border, and now discovering how many American citizens live in America. Can't do that, not allowed. A federal judge today ruled that the Trump administration is not allowed to ask on the 2020 census whether respondents are American citizens. That's one of many such lunatic court rulings in the past year restricting what the president was elected to do. Judges have also blocked the end of DACA. They've ordered the continuation of Obamacare's birth control mandate. And, of course, they blocked too many migrant deportations to count. On constitutional grounds were these decisions made? Not really. Basically just political. Robert Patillo is an attorney. He joins us tonight to talk about what happened today. Robert, thanks a lot for coming on. I appreciate it. So there are a lot of ways to approach this question of whether or not the census can count people who are not here legally, who are not citizens. But let me just remind you, the purpose of the census in the Constitution is to apportion congressional districts, okay? So here's why this is a really important question. We think there are about 22 million people illegally in our country, illegal aliens, 22 million. The average congressional district is about 700,000, 710,000. So that's the equivalent of over 30 congressional seats, okay? That makes a huge difference whether or not you count. I mean, it makes a difference potentially of who controls Congress, whether you count people who are not citizens in the congressional district. So why wouldn't you need to know?
Well, Tucker, 3 points on this. Point one, let's understand there's a statutory guideline. There's a law in place that the Commerce Department has to make this request 3 years prior to the census, and they missed that deadline. So just on a statutory ground, they missed the deadline. So, of course, the judge had to rule against them. Secondarily, they haven't asked this question on the census since the 1950s. Between 1820 and 1950, this question was on the census. It has not been there ever since. And the grounds that the government used to justify it was a Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act justification, which in no way, shape, or form passes any muster, because since the Voting Rights Act has been in place since 1965, the question has never, ever been asked. So if no president, no census since 1965 felt the need to use it, then clearly it is not dispositive of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Thirdly, let's understand that when this question was asked, it was used in the 1940s to round up Japanese citizens and intern them in internment camps. So clearly that does not meet the standards of 2019 American society.
Okay.
So of course
let me just go through these one by one very, very quickly. So using the Voting Rights Act as an argument against this sounds dumb to me. I agree. And there's no excuse for missing any kind of deadline. That sounds flaky. So I think that's right. You're right. But it elides the actual debate, which is, do we have a right to know who's in our country? And Democrats are arguing we don't. We don't actually have a right. As to what Franklin Roosevelt did to the Japanese, it's terrible. I would never defend that. Democrats should be ashamed of that. And I hope they are. The question, again, is, do we as a country have a right to know who's in our country? We don't even know how many illegal aliens we have. Why shouldn't we know, for the purposes of apportioning congressional districts, whether they're citizens or not? Like, that's a key question. And it's a sincere one to you.
Well, Tucker, what you have to understand is there's another mechanism for exactly that. It's the ACS, the annual census study sent to 1 in 30 households, which determines the composition of the country. That's not included in the census questions. That's how we know that there are 22 million illegal immigrants in the country right now. The reason that this is significant is we need to have an accurate count of individuals, of human beings, of live bodies in this country and households in every district, because that's how schools are apportioned. That's how emergency funds, that's how offices are apportioned. And we have individuals who are afraid to come forward, afraid to participate in the census, afraid to talk about those things, then they're not going to come forward.
Look, there's no evidence of that. That's just a talking point. I mean, we don't know.
No, that's not a talking point.
It is actually.
Organization said that.
First of all, there are no independent organizations. No one has produced those data. That's not a knowable thing. We don't know how many people are here illegally, so by definition, we can't know how many were too afraid to announce their presence. So actually, like, the question only is, should we try to know whether American citizens are being counted in congressional districts, and they're not. So why shouldn't we?
Well, what we need to be doing is understand that in the upcoming census, we have a $12 billion current budget to conduct that census. Wilbur Ross has already said they need $2 billion more dollars. Any roadblocks that are put in place that make it more difficult to have people respond to those census questions, the more roadblocks that are put in place to scare people away from actually participating and answering the government agent who's at your door asking you about your family, is just going to run up those costs, which is going to decrease the accuracy of that census.
Then why should we ask about race? Since the census, as you pointed out, was used by the Roosevelt administration to imprison Japanese people, why should we be asking about race? Doesn't that scare people?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely completely accurate argument. I think that's an antiquated way of measuring people. We have so many people in this country now who are biracial, who are from other countries. We need to reevaluate these things, but you can't do it when you miss deadlines.
Okay, well, I agree with you on that. And I definitely agree with you on the race question. Good for you, Robert. Great to talk to you. Thank you. Well, this country is set to have its next census in 2020. That's delineated in the Constitution. We have to every 10 years. Unless policies change, the census will be counting illegal aliens the same as everybody else. The census hasn't asked about citizenship status since 1950, meaning that a lot of states get a boost to their congressional representation because of the illegal immigrants in their state. This is a problem. It's not democratic. Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach says it is time to change that, and he joins us tonight. Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming on.
Great to be with you.
So the Constitution says you have to have a census to apportion congressional districts.
Yep.
And so the only people whose information matters are citizens. So it matters whether they're citizens or not, correct?
It absolutely does. Think of it this way. There are 710,000 people per representative in Congress. But if you live in a district like Maxine Waters' district out in California, probably half or more of your district is illegal aliens. And so you may only have 350 citizens voting in your district. Those citizens' vote counts twice as much as my vote or your vote if you live in a district that doesn't have tons of illegal aliens. So you have vote dilution where some people's vote matters more than others because they have tons of illegal aliens in their district.
But wait a second. I thought the liberals are always yelling about how every vote counts, every vote should matter the same as any other vote.
Yeah.
So why would they be for this?
Well, I think it's a dirty little secret that they don't want to talk about. And you're absolutely right. The 1964 decision of the Supreme Court, Westbury versus Sanders, says voting dilution is unconstitutional. You cannot have one congressional district where there are fewer voters than there are in another district. And because of illegal immigration, we have crazy disproportionalities, extraordinary numbers where, in a Midwestern seat, you might have to get 120,000 votes to win your election. In Waters District, you might only need 40,000.
So I don't understand the argument. I mean, the answer is really simple. Just check a box. Are you a citizen or not? Are you allowed to vote legally? That's the whole point of the census. So
exactly.
What's the argument against that?
The only argument against it that I have heard is a really lame one. They say that people will be afraid to answer the census form if it has the citizenship question, which is ridiculous, first of all. And secondly, we already asked the citizenship question on the American Community Survey, which about 1% of the population gets, and the Census Bureau asks that. It's an ongoing survey. The Democrats never complained about that. Only when suddenly we talk about putting the citizenship question back on the census do the people on the left start.
But why should we care if people who aren't allowed to vote in our elections are afraid to answer a census which is designed to apportion congressional districts?
Well, there's that too. If you're illegally in this country, we shouldn't be considering you a resident anyway, because you could go home at any day. You could be deported at any moment. So why in the world would we be worried about counting you?
Why would your feelings matter more than a fair election?
Exactly. And it's not just fair elections, too. Governments need this information. I as Secretary of State, cannot accurately calculate the registration rate, the percentage of eligible people who are registered, unless I know how many citizens I have. And right now, I just have an estimate. I don't have real numbers.
That is crazy. Secretary of State Chris Kobach of Kansas, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Good to see you.
Big controversy this week. Are you a U.S. citizen, yes or no? It continues to surround this whole citizenship question being added to the 2020 census by the Trump administration. Now some are predicting 24 million people may just skip it altogether.
Yeah, so to set this up, I mean, we've got the 2020 census coming up. Previous censuses have not asked households whether the people inside the household are citizens or not. And the Trump administration, with a focus on law and order and citizenship and understanding who's here legally and not legally, says, hey, what a great opportunity to get a true accounting of how many people we have here legally or illegally, so let's add it to the question. Right. There's been controversy from the left, though, because they don't want this question asked.
Well, the other side would say this can come across disrespectful. Why do you even have to ask that question? But you make a good point. This is probably one of the most important issues of this time in our country's history. In order to figure out how to move forward, we've got to get a better sense of what we are dealing with.
Sure.
And what Democrats are saying is that, look, if you put the citizenship question in there, if someone's here illegally, they're going to get nervous about that, and then they're not going to answer the other questions. They're not going to turn in a census, and we're not going to get an accurate reading of how many people are here and get the answers we need. Robert Shapiro was Undersecretary at the Commerce Department during the 2000 census, during the Clinton administration. He says the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross and Attorney General Jeff Sessions explicitly tied the collection of 2020 census information to federal law enforcement. That's what makes his directive so remarkable and so dangerous. My analysis, he says, detailed below, suggests some 24.3 million people would have good reason to skip the 2020 census if they believe their names and addresses could be shared with law enforcement. So you get the idea, Pete, that there are some who say, look, if somebody turns in a census and says, I'm not a citizen, and here's my name and here's my address, Jeff Sessions is going to send somebody to their door.
Well, that's not what the administration is saying they're doing. They're simply saying, let's get our arms around how many are here. Because look at that number, 24.3. That's a big number. That's either people who are here illegally and don't answer it, or people who are in households where there is someone who's illegal. You add that together, and that number could be larger than we already know. So if we want to get the hands around who's in our country and why, it makes sense to ask that question. I understand the arguments of the left per se, but I think that's why President Trump was elected, to say, either we have a country or we don't. Citizenship should matter.
That's why I think going into the midterms, immigration is still going to be
Major
probably one of the top issues.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.